We'll be talking about St. Frances Xavier Cabrini. She is a saint that until about 12 years ago I never heard of. The way I learned about her was pretty profound. A few of you guys may have heard this story in the testimony I gave a few weeks ago at the encounter night. I think I touched on it. But basically what happened was I was on a business trip to Denver, Colorado. And I had a meeting about 15-20 miles west of Denver, up in the mountains in a town called Evergreen. And on the way up I-70, I see this brown sign that says Cabrini Shrine. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. But it just kind of tucked in the back of my mind and just, okay, and it didn't really think much about it again. Went up and had my meeting. It was a real good meeting, came back down. And this was like on a Wednesday, and I was there for a weekend conference, but I scheduled some meetings ahead of time and then also met with people at the conference. So as I'm coming down the hill, I realized I got an extra hour or two to kill. I see this sign again, this Cabrini Shrine. And curiosity got the best of me. I'm like, I just got to check this thing out. So I get off the highway and travel up into the hills, about 5 miles on this windy road. And all of a sudden I come upon this area where there's like some buildings and it looks like a church and this big stone house thing. And I'm just like, well, this is interesting. So I went down there and I realized there's just this little settlement almost of things. And so I just started wandering around, and there was a chapel, there was a church up on this one hill, but then there's this little chapel, and there was a rosary garden, and then I saw this staircase going up a big hill, and at the top I could see this statue. It looked like just this big white statue. So I started poking around. I wound up going up the stairs, and there was Stations of the Cross going up the stairs. And then after that, there was the 15 traditional mysteries of the Rosary, and all the way up this hill, and you get to the top, and there's this giant statue. It turns out it's like 22 feet tall of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, big white statue. And at the base of it, there's a giant heart made of quartz stone, and it's probably, I don't know, 8 feet around. It's this big heart. And I'm just like, this is just a really curious place to me. And so I go down the hill, I go to this little chapel, and it's all around this St. Frances Xavier Cabrini, who I've never heard of before. And so, I'm kneeling in the chapel and I'm praying, and if you look in your workbook, there's a picture of the chapel kind of at the top of page 95 in the upper left there. There's just a million candles in there that they've got. You can buy a candle for like $4 or something like that and light it. And but it was just a really profound day. And I'm like, man, I wish I had more time to spend here. But I didn't really build much more, slop into my schedule. So I said, okay, well, next time I come to Denver, I'm going to go to this place. And I just kind of said, all right. Well, I went to the weekend conference, and for whatever reason, it got done early. Normally, on the last day, there's usually people that want to meet, and they go out to dinner and, talk business and things like that. But everybody just decided to leave. So suddenly, I had my Saturday afternoon open because I wasn't flying home until Sunday morning. And so I went back up to the shrine, and I spent the whole afternoon, and I went back up that hill and did the Stations of the Cross and prayed the rosary all the way up the hill and went around this rosary garden and just spent some time. There was this one place down by the rosary garden where there was this trough. I think there's a picture of it in here. Yeah, it's at the bottom of page 95, that lower left picture, and there's just like a sink. And I'm like, what's this sink thing? There's a little plaque there, and it says, on this date, something, 1912, Mother Cabrini struck a rock with her staff and water came out. I'm like, what? And so they were looking for water up here, and she literally miraculously found water up here. So I really was intrigued by this saint who I'd never heard of before. So when I got done, I went down to the gift shop and I purchased this picture right here of Mother Cabrini, and I also purchased this necklace that had a crucifix. It was one of the tight ones that had like puka beads or something like that, but then it had this crucifix right here. And up to this point, if I ever wore a crucifix, it was way down inside my shirt, but this thing's like right at my throat. And I'm like, I really feel called to buy this. I think I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna wear it. So I bought this and just had this just extraordinary afternoon at this shrine, and just wanted to learn more and more about this saint. Well, so drove back to Colorado Springs, where my flight was flying out of on Sunday morning. And if you've ever been on a Sunday morning flight, there's like nobody on it. So like this plane that holds about 150 people had like 9 people on it. And so I got bumped up to first class. And so I'm sitting like in seat 1B. And so I'm like right in the front row, big seat, I'm thinking, okay, I could sleep on the way home and things like that. But as I'm coming to the airport, I'm realizing I'm wearing a crucifix. And this suddenly isn't feeling really comfortable, and I'm really kind of worried about this. I just had a lot of anxiety all of a sudden. So I get on the plane, sit in my seat, and one of the flight attendants is up there, and they're always, many of you guys flown before, I would imagine. A bunch of people get flown. The flight attendants all kind of do, point out the exits, and they do what's called the flight attendant aerobics. They're pointing things out and doing all this kind of stuff. Well, all of a sudden, she looks down at me, and she's like me to this camera away, and she just looks at me and she points at her throat, and she goes, "I like your crucifix." And I was like, why did she pick then to say that to me? But it was absolutely what I needed to hear, because I had all this anxiety about doing it. And then somebody affirmed me that what I was doing was the right thing to do. So I got this consolation from God that I was on the right path. And after that, I never had anxiety about wearing a crucifix again. Even when I went back to work the next week, and here I am wearing a crucifix. They knew I was Catholic, but nobody said anything. It never became an issue, and it was okay. It was okay to go out in public and show my faith. So over the years, I got to know Frances Xavier Cabrini a little bit. There's a shrine of her in New York City as well. And I got to go to New York like once or twice a year. So when I went out to New York City, I built a little time in my schedule. And I took about a 45-minute subway ride up to the northern tip of Manhattan Island and saw her shrine there too. And it's just really cool. There's a picture of that one. If you look at the bottom right corner on there, you'll see this picture of an altar, and below the altar is a glass coffin, and in there is Mother Cabrini. Her body's in there. And so it seems kind of weird, but that's what we do as Catholics, right? So anyway, so I got to know more and more about this saint, and I realized as I learned more about her what an extraordinary life she had, and she had been having this profound effect on me over time. And so I picked up this book here, Too Small a World, at that shrine, and began reading it, and her life was just really amazing. Which you wouldn't think, okay, she's a nun, right? How amazing could a nun's life be? But she really led a very extraordinary life. She was born in 1850, and she was the youngest of 13 kids. And she was born when her mom was 52, so her mom was kind of at the probably past childbearing years. And but Frances was born, and she was born 2 months early. So in 1850, if you're born 2 months early, you're pretty small, you're probably not going to make it, because you see these families that had a lot of children back then, and a lot of them died. A lot of them died in childbirth. A lot of them died when they were young kids. So her chances of survival were not great, but she survived. But she was always small. She was always a little sickly, and but she, her mom was like super religious. Her mom would get up an hour early every day and pray, and then try to get to daily mass. And she got to daily mass most days, and then she'd spend an hour before bed praying. And this is with 13 kids. Okay, so anybody who says they're too busy to pray, I don't buy it. Okay, if this woman can do it, we can find 5 or 10 minutes to pray. Her father also was very religious. He spent a lot of time in prayer. His mother and father together had some devotions. And a number of the sisters, in particular, there's one sister named Rose, who was much older than Frances, and she was kind of the one who was in charge of taking care of Francesca. And Francesca really looked up to Rose. Even though Rose was kind of strict, it wasn't like she was mean to her, but she was just very, here's the way it's going to be. Rose's way or the highway. And, so she pulled her hair back really tight, and kept her really prim and proper, and really kind of taught her, just kind of, a lot about how we act and things like that. And she was strict, but she was really good to her. But it was just, that was Rose's way. And Francesca really looked up to her. And she just wanted to please Rose, because she looked at Rose like a mother, because she just really cared about her older sister. So there's a story when she was 8. She went to visit an uncle of hers, and already at this point, she was already kind of starting to, she'd been exposed to a lot of, devotions from her parents. She went to a Catholic school, so she was being taught by nuns, and she'd dress up her dolls like nuns and things like that. But when she was 8, she was already thinking, someday I want to be a missionary. She had heard about this one saint called St. Francis Xavier, and realized they kind of had the same first name, and said, I want to be like him. He was a missionary, and he went to Japan and wanted to go to China. She was, I want to be a missionary that goes to Japan and China. And so from a very young age, and so what she would do is she was visiting her uncle, and near there was this canal. And what she would do is she would go down to the canal, and she'd build these little boats, out of like a piece of wood or some leaves or something like that, and she put little violets on there, and she would place them in the canal, and these are her missionaries that she was sending off, and they would go down the canal. Well, one day she wasn't watching what she was doing, and she slipped, and she fell in. And the current was really swift there. It started carrying her downstream a little bit, and just a little ways down, there was this drainage tunnel. And if she would have gone into that drainage tunnel, she surely would have drowned. But she all of a sudden, she kind of wakes up on the bank right before the drainage tunnel. And like another cousin was there and ran and got their uncle, who was the priest in the town. It said, Francesca fell in the canal, I think she's dead. And so they went running back there, and she came to, and her uncle said, who pulled you out of the canal? And because there's nobody here, right? If somebody would have pulled her out, they would have probably tried to make sure she was okay. There's nobody there. And she goes, I don't know, I just found myself on the shore. He goes, are you sure? Asked the cousin, did you see anybody? He's like, no, I didn't see anybody. He says, well, it must have been your guardian angel saved you, because there's something that you need to do for the Lord. But he also said, he says, stay away from the canal. Stay away from the water. It's so dangerous. Can you imagine if I had to tell your mom that you drowned? And she's like, oh, please don't tell my mother. Please don't tell my mother. And he's like, well, I kind of have to. And she's like, she thought about it. She goes, okay, well, please don't tell Rose. Don't tell my older sister, because she didn't want Rose to be disappointed in her. So she developed this fear of water. And again, in the 1850s, 1860s, if you were going to go anywhere, especially to China, you were going by boat. Right? So she had this conflict going on. I want to be a missionary, but now I'm kind of afraid of water because of what happened to me. So anyway, so she grew up, she became of age, she was 16, 17 years old, and she did join a religious order. She started studying for that. There were a number of things that happened. There's a lot to her story, but the first order that she joined, the leader was kind of unfit. She just wasn't a really good person. But Frances, she stayed with it, and there was a couple other the people that were there that were studying that. They all kind of started to hang out together, and they wound up taking their going through their novitiate together, and they wound up taking the habit together. But at this point, they started. I don't know if it was in that order, if it was in another order that they kind of went and did some things with. The bishop assigned them to run an orphanage, and where they are, just to give you an idea. I should have said this at the beginning. So they're up in Milan, Italy. And I don't know if you guys know your geography really well, but if you've got the boot of Italy kind of coming down here like this, and Switzerland's up here, Milan is kind of in the north, kind of between Switzerland and the sea right there. And so really far in northern Italy is where they are. But so she starts working with these orphanages, and they're doing such a good job, and they're there's a lot of kids at the orphanages, and people are bringing it there, and the kids are really doing well. And so the bishop asked them to start another one. And so they started another one a little bit ways away in town, and the same thing. And pretty soon the bishops had them start like 3 or 4 or 5 orphanages, and they've been getting more and more nuns as part of this group. And so at this point, the bishop sees what she's doing. He says, I really think that you should start your own order. And Frances, she's like, I don't know what that means, but if this is what I'm called to do, because one of the things that she was really big on was obedience to her superiors. So if the bishop says to do this, this is what I'm being asked to do, it's what I'm going to do. So she writes down what's called the rules of the order, and they have to submit these to the Pope, so the Pope can then, take a look at them and say, yes, you can start a new order or not. And so her bishop looked him over and he goes, yeah, this looks really good. He takes him down to the Pope Leo XIII. This is in about 1880, so she's about 30 years old. And Pope Leo XIII had just been elected Pope in 1878. And Pope Leo XIII was kind of a kindred spirit of hers. He was like kind of a small guy. He was like sickly his whole life. He was elected Pope in 1878. They're like, this guy isn't going to last long. And he was Pope until 1903. He's like number 3 or 4 on the list of longest times people were Pope. He died like when he was 93 years old or something like that. But so he saw these rules of her order, and he was just emphatic about it. He's like, approve them. Just this is really good. I want to see this happen. And so he approved the beginning of this order. And after that, then he called for Francis to come down, and they spoke about this, and she really felt like, I really want to go to China. I really want this to be the thing. And she presents this to him, and he says, that's he doesn't say it like this, but he's like that's a really good feeling you have. But he says, but I don't want you to go east. I want you to go west. I want you to go to the United States. And again, think about what's going on in the 1880s, right? You guys know that in the 1880s, there was a lot of immigration from Europe to the United States. And a lot of people from like Ireland, and a lot of people from Italy especially are going. And when the Irish and the Italians wind up getting the Americas, they're not treated really well at all. And people would kind of go like, oh, you're Italian, you're kind of inferior, you need to stay over here. And so they didn't get any job opportunities. They kind of were impoverished and things like that. And, we kind of all know now it's kind of a ridiculous way to think, just because you're from a certain country or because you're a certain type of person that you're bad or you're inferior. I mean, that's a ridiculous way to think. But this is the way it was. And so Pope Leo, he's like, I need you to go over there and I need you to minister to our people because there's a shortage of Italian priests over there and Italian nuns, and we need somebody over there who can get things done. And he had heard about what she had been doing up there with orphanages. So he's like, I want you to go there and start schools and orphanages and things like this in New York City. And again, remember, New York City is where all the immigrants are coming into. So New York City grew a lot in kind of the 1830s to 1880s, 1890s. It was growing like crazy, but there were these slums where the Italians lived, and the slums where the Irish lived, and things like that. And so Francis was like, okay. And her and like 6 of her nuns, they get on a ship, and they got like about a 10-day voyage to go over there. None of them been on a ship. Remember, Francis, she's terrified of water, right? But she's going to do this out of obedience. The Pope said to do this. So she gets on the ship, and as soon as she gets on the ship, it's like her health like got a lot better. It's like the sea air and the salt. I mean, everybody else is down below decks. All the nuns are down there. They're seasick and things like that. And Frances, she's up on the deck, and she's like, I've never felt so good in all my life. And so from time to time, the other nuns would come up and they'd sing songs and they'd do devotions and things like this. And the people were, like really happy that there were nuns praying on their ship, because one night they were coming over and all of a sudden the engines conked out. What's going on? And once daybreak came up, they woke up and there was icebergs all around the ship. And they realized if they would have gone through that in the dark, they probably would have struck an iceberg. But for some reason, the engines mysteriously cut out. And so the nuns were up there singing songs of praise and all this kind of stuff. And people are like, thank goodness there was nuns on board. Otherwise, we probably all would have died. But anyway, they get to New York, and the Archbishop in New York, he had sent for them. He says, we got a place all picked out for you. It's all good to go. And they get to New York, and they have dinner with the Archbishop that first night. And he's like, didn't you get my letter? And they're like, what letter? The letter telling you not to come. He's like, I need you to just kind of get back on the boat and head back. And she just very politely says, no, we can't do that. We've been called here by the Pope to be here, so we need to do this. He goes, I don't have a place for you right now. So they wind up staying in this boarding house, and it's just gross. There's roaches and bed bugs and mice and all this kind of stuff. These nuns, and they're just kind of trying to get a good night's sleep. But Frances stayed up all night and she prayed, and just kind of prayed to get them through. But she felt this exhilaration because she knew that a venture that was started that had obstacles in the way at the beginning was usually very successful. Okay, so she had this confidence that everything was going to be okay. And so the Archbishop then talked with them the next day. He's like, I don't have a spot for you. We'll do the best we can. Well, this rich woman up kind of in Midtown Manhattan had heard about what was going on. And she said, well, I've got this house and I've got it all rented out. I'm going to rent it to your nuns. I'm going to pay the rent. I'm going to give it to your nuns for a year. And the Archbishop's like, you can't live there. This is like in the rich neighborhood. And this is going to cause a scandal. And when they see that the Italians are there, it was just like all this weird stuff. But but he finally recanted, and the woman who was rich, she kind of and pleaded to the bishop and said, doesn't it say in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, not give us our bread a year from now? Because that's what the archbishop kept saying. What are you going to do in a year? And so she convinced him that this is the way to go. And so Francis and her nuns had a place to stay now. And they started working. They would go out in the streets and they would beg for money so they could get money for the orphanages and things like that. And this orphanage just grew and grew and grew until they had about 300 kids that they were taking care of. And it was about this time, there was a time in Italy where this happened too, but they had this one day where, they were always kind of living right on the edge, right, of just being able to provide what they needed to provide. And they had this storeroom, and it was where they stored the bread. And one of the nuns who was going to prepare the meals went there, and there was like nothing. There was like some dried crusts on the floor, and that was about it. There was nothing there. And she went down to Mother Cabrini, and she says, Mother, there's nothing to feed the kids. And she says, well, go back and check again. The nun's like, well, all right, I'll go back and check again. And she opens the door, and there's a room full of bread. And she went back down there, and she's like, Mother Cabrini, there's all this bread, and it wasn't there. And Mother Cabrini says, well, you must not have looked hard enough. And this nun's going, I know what I saw. I know there was nothing there, and now there's a room full of bread. And so Mother Cabrini, again, wanting to kind of take any attraction or any attention from herself, said, okay, well, the Lord must have provided it for us. Let's thank the Lord for that. But so they started taking care of lots of people. And there was times when they still had some of the nuns back in Italy. So she would go back to Italy, and she would bring more nuns back to the United States. And there was times when the Pope would call her back and forth. Again, this is in the 1880s. It wasn't like the Pope calls her up and says, hey, come back to Italy. He sends a letter. She gets the letter. She goes on a ship. She goes back there. It's a 7 to 10 day voyage. Goes to Italy, sees the Pope, comes back. And so there's a lot of back and forth. But again, by this time, she has no fear of the water. And she's just, things are really starting to take off. Her orders are starting to grow in New York. And they start starting things in other cities as well. So over the course of the next 15 or 20 years, she starts stuff in Chicago and Philadelphia and Denver and Seattle and Los Angeles and all these places. Again, this is in the 1800s, right? So this isn't like hop on a plane, it's 4 hours from Chicago to LA, right? I mean, she's taking the train. And one time she was on the train, and this is the time when there were still train robbers. This is like in the 1890s. And so she's on the train, and all of a sudden these train robbers stop the train, or they try to stop the train, and they're gonna try and rob the train. And so suddenly the window in her cabin breaks, okay? And so, but the train manages to get away. And the conductor comes in to check on her, and right behind her head on the wall is this nail that they had used like kind of a bullet. They must have been shooting nails or something like that. And he says, there's no way this could have missed you. And so they realized that she was miraculously saved because it was like behind her head. And so she goes, well, the good Lord must have some plans for me, that he needs me alive for those. So she just had all these really wild adventures. And so she was down in New Orleans for a time, and she started an orphanage and a hospital down there. And suddenly she's down in Nicaragua, and she's doing things. And again, 1890s, early 1900s. It's not easy to get around. She's everywhere. There's a story about her that from Nicaragua, she goes down along the Pacific coast of South America, and she takes an alpaca over the Andes Mountains to get to Buenos Aires. This little nun, right? I mean, it's just, this book is just full of all these really awesome stories. And she also had his devotion to Saint Philomena, who I had a devotion to as well. And so there was other similarities in here of things that St. Francis had. She talks about one of her favorite Bible verses was Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That was a verse that I had adopted as one of my go-to verses during this time when this was going on. The other thing that was in here is that she was very good in all of her school subjects, but the one that she liked the most was geography. And she loved sitting there with maps and thinking about where she was going. I spent 29 years as a map maker. So there was this connection between me and Francis, that all these things that she kind of liked to do, I also like to do. So it's like she kind of had called me to get to know more about her. It was really interesting in that way. But she spent most of her time in the Western Hemisphere, and then between there and Europe. But her and Pope Leo XIII just had this really it was kind of like Pope John Paul II and Mother Teresa, very much the same thing. They had this really close friendship. And, whenever they were together, it was just like, they were just like brother and sister. They were just so happy together and things like that. But whenever she went back to Europe, she always stopped and saw Pope Leo, and he always gave her the time and gave her an audience and things like that. They just had a really special friendship. And so, so she, like I said, she was starting orphanages, she was starting hospitals, she was starting schools. And in all this time, her and her nuns, so her order just grew like crazy. And she oftentimes would need money for these things. And sometimes money would just show up. She'd be, one time there was a guy and he just said, Mother, I feel called to do something for your order. Let me give you some money to build this orphanage. And so he gives her, $50,000, which at that time, $50,000 would buy a lot more now than $50,000 would buy now. There was another time where there's this guy, she was kind of talking with him about giving money to him, and if you look at this picture, she's kind of got this stare. I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but she's kind of got this way she kind of almost looks through you. It's kind of one of those things that no matter where you are in the picture, she's looking at you. So she's kind of looking at me now. But she was talking with this guy, and he's like, "No, Mother, I don't donate to the church," and she knew he had a lot of money, and she knew that he was Catholic, but he was kind of away from his faith. And she just kind of looked at him and just kind of kept staring and says, we really need this money. And all of a sudden he just kind of crumbles and goes, okay, how much do you need? And he writes her a check for like $100,000 or just some insane amount of money to build a hospital. And so she was building these hospitals, and the money just always showed up. And it was really intense that way. But she in the book says that she had a devotion to Saint Philomena, like I said, who also is someone that you can call on to help you in financial crisis. So she was praying to the saints as well. She had a devotion to several saints like that as well. But she wound up dying in 1917. So she was 67 years old. And her path to canonization was pretty short. She was beatified in the 30s and was canonized in 1946. And she was the first United States citizen who was ever canonized. So she had gotten U.S. citizenship after emigrating here from Italy. She was the first. She wasn't the first American born. That would be Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. But she was the first American who was canonized a saint. And so she's got a real. If you go into these cities like Chicago or L.A., you'll see this name Cabrini. These are things that are named after her. There were some of the hospitals, or Cabrini Hospital, things like that. But I would encourage you guys, what I do with these is I have these videos and I post them, and there'll be some pictures. I did this talk for the middle schoolers. I put some pictures in there of a couple of these shrines in color. I'll do that when I post this one as well. But I would encourage you to get to know Frances. She's just, she's a really intense saint, I would say. I mean, like I said, she was very sickly. She wasn't expected to live, but she lived this extraordinary life that, by the grace of God, that she was able to do all these things. And so, I think it's a real good example for us about what we can do when the odds are stacked against us, whether it's through physical or through, lack of trust in God and things like that. She just trusted in God, and it would always wind up happening for her. I was going to tell you one of the curious miracles. They need 2 miracles to become a saint, and one for her beatification is there was a child, when babies were born, they would put this nitrate solution in their eyes. It was supposed to be like a 1% solution to kind of clear out their eyes or something after they were born. Well, there's this one child, and they wanted to put in a 50% solution in his eyes, and it blinded him instantly. And the parents prayed to St. Francis, and his eyesight was restored, even though his entire corneas had been burned. His eyesight was entirely restored. It was a miraculous healing. And then the other miracle she had is one of her nuns was cured of an incurable disease about 10 or 15 years after she died, and they were praying to Mother Cabrini to heal her. So she definitely is a nun that has miracles attributed to her, so I'd encourage you to get to know her. And if we ever do a backpacking trip and we're going through Colorado, we're definitely stopping at this place. So